We are in the book of Matthew, and we have one left. No, we did get into chapter 12. I was going to say we had one left in 11, but we did get into chapter 12. One left in this section of 12. Here Jesus is pointing out that his disciples did not do wrong, contrary to the accusation made by some of the Pharisees. They're going through a grain field, walking on the Sabbath, and they began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. Of course, corn in the King James, we would say grain. It probably would be wheat. And I think it's Luke's account that talks about they rubbed them in their hands, and just kind of a very small, crude way of threshing to separate the husk and the chaff, and you could just blow it away, and you have a few bites of grain. They're hungry, so it's kind of a little snack as they're walking along. We talked about the provision in the law of Moses for that, and so Jesus asks a few different questions here. Have you not read, verse 3, what David did when he was an hungered? They that were with him, how he entered into the house of God, did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests. And we dealt with that question, so I won't go over everything there, the Old Testament background and all that. But just to remind us, Jesus, it's definitely, Jesus is definitely not teaching situation ethics, as some people try to point out here. But the question is sometimes asked, well, did Jesus approve of what David did? I don't think that he did. I think Jesus is making the point here that he's pointing out their inconsistency. They gave David, we might say, a free pass, even though he violated that law, eating the showbread. But here, Jesus' disciples haven't really even done anything wrong. What they did was not a violation of the Sabbath. It was, hardly could be tantamount to threshing work on the Sabbath. And what their mistake was, at least in part, of course, a lot of mistakes when you get to unpacking the Pharisees and Jesus' rebukes toward them throughout his ministry. But one of their big mistakes was trying to turn the Sabbath into some type of constrictive, restrictive law that was meant to somehow bind, and just forgetting the fact that God gave man the Sabbath for man's good. Yes, there were laws about it, laws that were to be taken very seriously and not to be broken. You see that in the Old Testament when the Sabbath law was first given. But it's not something where, you got a few pods of grain and you rubbed them in your hands, you're working on the Sabbath. And no, that's not the intent of it at all. And so what they did was not wrong. And Jesus is pointing out, you give David a pass, who very clearly did violate the law, because, David is your hero. But here are my disciples, they have not done wrong, and you're trying to find fault with them. So he's pointing out to them, their hearts were not right. And so that's kind of the long and short of that. There's another question, though, here in verse 5, and I was hoping we'd get to it last week because it's connected, obviously, but we just flat ran out of time. But he says, or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Then he says, but I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. And so Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath day, regardless of really any of this, we might say. Nevertheless, what he did was not, again, people sometimes try to say, well, Jesus points out he's Lord of the Sabbath day and he can violate it if he wants to. No, he lived and died under the old law perfectly. He says in John 8:29, talking about the Father, I do always those things that please him. But he makes another point here when it comes to the Sabbath. Not all activity or work is forbidden, period. If you're an Israelite, you're living under the old law, and it's the Sabbath day, you don't get up and say, well, you get your kids, particularly your male children, up and say, let's go. It's harvest season. We're burning daylight. Let's go get to harvest in the field. It's the Sabbath day. However, what is one of the busiest days of your week if you were a priest under the old law? That's the Sabbath day. They're very busy in activity on the Sabbath. And, it's kind of like, there's not a Christian Sabbath, and we talked about this Wednesday night, talking about the old law being superseded by the new. There's not a Christian Sabbath. There's not some kind of carryover into the new. God didn't change the Sabbath to Sunday. God did away with the Sabbath. But Christians are together on the first day of the week. And some people have, personal convictions about, well, I try not to do much on a Sunday or whatever. And that's fine as long as that's not bound on others. But again, even if you think of it in those terms, Sunday being, if you want to treat it as a day of rest personally, but yet if you're a preacher, that's your busiest day. If you're giving lessons and teaching and things like that, even as a Bible class teacher, it may not be that you're the local preacher, but if you're getting together a Bible class lesson and if you're taking that seriously and putting in the time in the study, that takes some effort, and there's effort in presenting that. And so sometimes, I've even heard situations where preachers talking to the leadership of a congregation, whether the men or the elders, and sometimes they say, well, we want you to work 5 days a week. Saturday and Sunday will be off. It's like, well, that's not an off day on Sunday. But the same idea here with the priest. Obviously, the difference being under the old law, the Sabbath rest was mandated, but not for the priest in this sense. Now, if you were a priest that wasn't carrying out those duties on the Sabbath day, you would rest. And so Jesus, again, is making a point here. Levitical priests, they carried out priestly duties just like on any other day of the week. If it was your course, your turn, whatever, to go and to do that, but you carried that out on the Sabbath just as any other day. The priest would offer the lamb each morning, each evening. That was a daily sacrifice, morning sacrifice, evening sacrifice. That didn't change because it was a Sabbath. They still offered those. There were additional sacrifices on the Sabbath. Numbers, I printed these verses so I could get to them a little quicker. Numbers 28, 3 and 4 talks about the morning and evening sacrifice. Numbers 29, 9 and 10, their meat offering is the way the King James puts it. Most other newer versions have it updated as the meal offering. Meal offering shall be of flour mingled with oil, 3/10 deals to a bullock and 2/10 deals to one ram, several tenth deal for one lamb throughout the 7 lambs. But it's the idea of there were special offerings to be made on the Sabbath. This burnt offering, the meal offering. On a continual basis, there would be 12 loaves, 12 cakes of showbread sitting on the table of showbread. On the Sabbath, the showbread was changed out. Put fresh bread there. And the priest would eat that old showbread in the holy place. So again, Jesus said the priests, as the King James puts it, profane the temple, meaning they did things just like any other day. We sometimes use that word a little bit differently. We say, if we say somebody profanes something, what are we typically meaning by that? Degrading, defiling. We even use that term to describe speech. If somebody's, I always like to talk to Bob because he's from New York. It's kind of not fair, Bob, because you've been here so long. You're basically a Southerner now, like it or not. But I do. Bob and I, we've gone back and forth on this sometimes, and we kind of have fun with it. But in the Deep South, we just sometimes say somebody's cussing. But sometimes people use as a kind of a synonym for that. profane speech. But the base meaning of the word, and especially as it's used here in the King James, is just common. And there's a lot of talk in the Old Testament about treating things as hallowed or holy or sanctified or set apart, all those synonymous terms, versus treating them as profane, common. And that's what he's talking about here. It's not that the priest somehow denigrated or defiled the temple, but they profaned it. It was like any other day because they're carrying out those duties. That's what the law called for. So that's the point he's making here. They did it just as if those activities were everyday common stuff, but it still had to go on even on the Sabbath day. And so Jesus said the priests were blameless, just like he said his disciples in the matter of, getting a few heads of grain and rubbing them in their hands to eat. They were blameless. So he shows it was possible under the old law to carry out certain acts, even on the Sabbath day, without violating the Sabbath law. And again, it's understanding, why did God make or set the Sabbath law? It wasn't just, an arbitrary rule. Sometimes God has commands that we may not fully understand, and they're still binding. But here Jesus points back to the purpose for that Sabbath law. It was for man's good, because man needs rest. And so again, Jesus calls his disciples, those priests who treated the Sabbath day as common, carrying out their priestly duties. In both cases, he says, in fact, in verse 7, if you had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. So, guiltless in both cases. That's when the Lord calls somebody innocent, guiltless, blameless, well, that's what they are, right? Same way, if the Lord calls someone guilty to be blamed, well, that certainly is the case. But he's pointing out here, their heart was not right. They're inconsistent. They're just fault finding is what it comes down to. They're just looking for something to accuse because of their jealousy, their envy, and Jesus not fitting their preconceptions, their mold that they had for what the Messiah was going to be, how he would act, what he would accomplish. It didn't. Jesus' mission was, they're starting to see, it doesn't fit our mold. He's not coming to attack the Romans and throw off Roman rule and establish some kind of an earthly kingdom and restore the glory days of David and Solomon. And so they say, well, we're not too crazy about this. Now they start looking for things that they can try to, of course, later on they're going to try to entrap him in his words. But that's the idea here. He points out your heart's not right, you're inconsistent, and bottom line, you're just flat wrong. So that's Matthew 12, really the first question there, 3 and 4. Second question in verse 5. Now, moving on to Matthew 12:11. Of course, this is right here still kind of in that same context. He leaves from that area. He goes into the synagogue. There's a man there which had his hand withered. They asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? That they might accuse him. So again, they're trying to entrap Jesus. We touched on this last week. The day of the week that you have, at least specified day of the week, that you see the most when it comes to a miracle of Jesus is the Sabbath day. And I don't know that we're ever specifically told in so many words why, but it's, at least in some passages, it's very much implied that he's doing this to make a point, that you making the Sabbath about these restrictive laws that go far beyond what God has said and what God has determined should be, that's not right. That's hypocritical. And so a lot of times you'll see Jesus healing on the Sabbath. It's not that he's just trying to provoke for the sake of provoking. Sometimes people will do something like that, and I've even seen Christians do something like that. They know someone has, when I was in Centerville, Alabama, just a little, I don't know, 45 minutes or so west, maybe south and west of Tuscaloosa. And I would go there and help. There was an elderly brother, and he just was getting to the point where it was difficult for him to do Sunday morning, Sunday night, a Bible class Sunday morning, a Bible class Wednesday night. And so they'd asked me to come down there and work with them, a little small congregation, 25, 30 people. But one day, Brother Wheeler was his name, and I don't know if he's any relation to the Wheelers here in Bremen or not, but probably if you go back far enough, I imagine so. But just, man, he was just such a good man and such an encouragement to me and a help to me in that particular work, but also just as a young Christian. He told me one day, he says, I don't even know how we got talking about it, but he says, Sister so-and-so, he says, you may have noticed she never stays for our fellowship meals. I said, yeah, now that you mention it, I have noticed that. He said, she has a scruple, an issue of conscience about eating in the building. She doesn't say anybody's sinning by it, but for her, she came from that background, and for her, it bothers her. And so whenever we have a meal, she just quietly leaves after services. And I said, well, that's good to know, because I never knew, and I had noticed that she doesn't stay, and you don't always know why. And so, would I, or I could have gone and said something sometime maybe to her, hey, Sister so-and-so, why are you not eating in the building? You got a problem with that? Don't you know the Bible teaches there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a building. And I could have really, tried to force the issue on that. If I know somebody has a scruple about something, do I try to force the issue and tell them, hey, look, you're immature in the faith. You need to grow up. This is silly. That would be just provoking. Now, there might be an occasion where you could do some gentle teaching and encouraging, but just to say something, to do something simply for the sake of provoking that person. That's not what Jesus did when he healed on the Sabbath. Make no mistake. But at the same time, he does take advantage sometimes of the opportunity to teach them and to get them to see your idea of the Sabbath, what you have tried to turn it into, is changing God's law, and it's changing God's very intent for the Sabbath. And so sometimes I've said before, it's like Jesus healed on purpose on the Sabbath just to make a point. Well, yes, that's true, but just understand it's not simply for the sake of, I'm going to get them, I'm going to provoke them.
Jesus knew a big change was coming. They didn't know a big change was coming, but he's kind of trying to ease them into it, maybe.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe that's a way of kind of easing, and that seems that's a lot of his ministry as a whole is that he's kind of pointing out that this change is coming, and so when it does happen, it's not like it just totally blindsides everybody. And of course, there were even prophecies, and so Jesus gives a little bit. I've heard the illustration by a number of preachers when I was growing up, talking about what was the term they would use? The twilight age of the Mosaic dispensation. Because you got these prophecies, and it's kind of like, when the sun's about to come up. It hasn't come up above the horizon yet, but you start to get that it's almost gray outside, right? But you can, it's not the same as complete darkness, where you can't even, it might be so dark you can't see your hand in front of your face. You can make out figures and silhouettes and things, but as it gets closer and closer to sunrise, there's a little bit more, and you sort of see that with the teaching of Jesus, his teaching ministry. He's shedding more light And when you get to, Pentecost, it's like the sun's up above the horizon, and by the time you reach the end of the first century and the completion of the New Testament, it's like high noon. I mean, the sun is out, and there's no excuse now. We live, and that seems to be kind of the idea with Hebrews 1, 1 and 2. God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spake in times past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. Now we live in the sunlight, and sort of a play on words there, S-O-N, sunlight, just like the sun, S-U-N, sheds light. And so, I think that may be something to that he's sort of helping people to understand this big change is coming. So here, they ask him. Now, there are other occasions where Jesus is going to ask them, hey, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? They ask him here. And so he asks, as he often did, a question back to them. There's a couple of questions here. I have it listed in my notes from Papa just as one question from verse 12, but there actually are a couple here. And some of this depends on, and this is where I was going to look at my other translation. Sometimes it depends on the translation. What are we at? Verse. So New King James has it as two questions. So does, no, American Standard has just one question in verse 11. ESV, one question in verse 11. And New American Standard Bible, one question in verse 11. So, but looking back at, I'm reading from the King James Version here, he said unto them, answering their question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day? Will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. Reading on in the text, he then saith he to the man, stretch forth thine hand, and he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole, like as the other. And wouldn't it be great if verse 14 said the Pharisees realized the point that Jesus was making, and they said, praise God, this man is healed. But that's not what verse 14 says, is it? Then the Pharisees went out and held a council against him, how they might destroy him. Now, how sad is that? Sometimes they would say, we want to see a miracle from you. Well, guess what? They just saw a miracle here, and they get together, they put their heads together, and they would try to figure out how can we destroy him. Of course, when Jesus knew it, verse 15 says, he withdrew himself from thence, and great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all. So, the question that he asks, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? Here's Jesus. He's in a synagogue. This man has a withered hand. It's an effort to attack, to accuse Jesus. They asked this question of him, so he asked this question back to them. The conclusion here, the overall lesson he's teaching them and us, incidentally, is, well, humans are of more value than animals. They are, as he says back in chapter 6, we notice in that context, 6:26, of more value than birds. Also in chapter 10, verse 31, he mentions this. But it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath day. If your sheep falls into a pit, he says, I thought I had the cross-reference here. Has anybody got a cross-reference in your Bible? There's another passage. Did I not put that? I guess I did not put that in my notes. Anyway. Is that what I'm thinking of? Let me go look. Luke would say 14. If I had read just a little bit further ahead this week, I'm in the book of Luke in my daily reading, but I didn't quite get to that chapter. Yeah, which of you shall have a donkey or an ox fall into a pit and will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day? And I guess that's got to be it. I just felt like it was slightly different, but that's a parallel context. But the idea here is whether it's a sheep, a donkey, an ox, and of course, even if it's a sheep and it falls into a pit, is that work to get it out? Well, what about if your donkey or an ox falls into a pit? Well, you better believe there's going to be some work involved in that to get him out. But they didn't have any problem with that. They understood that that's a matter of expediency. The ox in the ditch, we sometimes even use that expression now. Somebody will talk about something, well, you know, I wanted to be there Sunday, but, you know, had an ox in the ditch. My car broke down and, you know, maybe it's really cold outside, and so I had to go and do whatever so I could get this thing running, and, you know, because my family's with me, and we're just out in this freezing cold, and by the time I got here, you know, service was over, whatever. But a situation where we might say the ox was in the ditch. Well, would the equivalent of what these Pharisees were doing would be in somebody in that situation to say, hey, look, brother, you need to come forward, and you need to repent publicly for that sin, because you forsook the assembly. No, that's not the case at all. It's a situation that can't be helped. And that's what Jesus is showing here. It is lawful to do well, to do good on the Sabbath day. Jesus said so. And so all the action that Jesus, in all of the action that he took, helping people on the Sabbath day, healing people, casting out demons, whatever it might be, he never once violated the Sabbath. In fact, he often showed how they, in their effort to supposedly to keep the Sabbath, that they made rules about it that God had never made. And, you know, that's what the Pharisees were champions at, right? Making rules where God had never made it. In fact, he's going to say later on in Matthew chapter 23, when he just, scathingly rebukes the Pharisees and the scribes, and even in Luke's account, the lawyers, those were experts in the law of Moses, supposedly. And one of the things that he'll say in Matthew 23 is, you bind heavy burdens, grievous to be borne. But, he says, what? You won't lift them with your little pinky finger. You won't touch it yourself. But you bind that burden on somebody else. Hypocrisy. So that's the idea here. He's pointing out it's not wrong to do good on the Sabbath. What if you were going along and here's your neighbor, maybe he's got a cart or something like that, and it's broken down. You just keep right on riding. I would help you, brother, but it's a Sabbath. You don't need to be fixing that yourself, by the way. See you later. I'll pray for you. Well, that's silly. And it's just, he shows how wrong their laws that they had made for God, or at least attempted to make for God, how wrong that was. Humans are of much more value than animals. He says, you know what, your animal falls in a ditch, you're going to get him out. But humans are a lot more value than animals, so there's nothing.
Possessions and not on the soul of man.
Right. Absolutely. Robert said they place value on their possessions more so than the soul of a human being. And that, bingo. That's hitting the nail on the head right there. And that was one of their greatest problems. They would elevate all these different things, and they would elevate their own rules and laws and traditions above the soul of a human or above the law of God itself. And how sad that was, and is. It still happens to this day, right? We understand that. So, good thoughts there. Well, all right, the next question here is going a little bit further down into chapter 12. So at this point, they're taking counsel, held a counsel, how they might destroy him, verse 15 or 14 tells us. So, Jesus is healing there at the end of 15. It's fulfilling prophecy, verse 17 tells us. He quotes from Isaiah there. Then, verse 22, they bring to him one possessed with a demon. And this is one of those where I've told y'all I like the King James. I'm so familiar with it from my childhood. Most of my verses that I've memorized even back to childhood, but especially like in preaching school, we memorize so many verses. They come from the King James, so it's just easier for me. But man, sometimes there's certain little things about the King James that just grate on me. And one of them is using hell for Hades. There's a difference in hellfire, Gehenna, eternal hellfire, versus the Hadean realm. But here's another one of my really just frustrations, the use of the word devil instead of demon. The American Standard actually updates this and uses demon. There's only one devil, Satan. There's just the one. He is the devil. He is Satan. But there are numerous demons, spiritual beings. These sometimes take the form of, talking about Satan's angels. Sometimes these are, we've talked before about these spirits that would possess people during the time of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus. Seems the best explanation is these are disembodied spirits of wicked people. And this was allowed, permitted for a brief time, that the power of Jesus over the spirit realm would be displayed, and even on into a little bit into the first century with his apostles, that they show that the power of Jesus extends even beyond this earth into the spirit realm. But here's someone who is possessed with a demon, blind and dumb, in other words, mute. And, of course, Jesus heals him insomuch that the blind and dumb both spake and saw. The people are amazed, said, "Is not this the Son of David?" That's another way of saying, is not this the Christ, the Messiah? But when the Pharisees heard it, they're not going to stand for that because, they've already decided they want to destroy Jesus. So they hear people going, wow, maybe this is the prophet. I mean, how could it not be that this is the prophet like unto Moses? This is the Messiah. This is the Christ. Because, look what he's doing. He's casting out demons. He's even got power over the spirit realm. And the Pharisees go, I don't know about that now. This fella doth not cast out demons, but by Beelzebub, the prince of the demons. Well, okay, you can't argue with it. Somebody might say, if they say, well, I don't know about that. Somebody says, well, we all saw this guy. We all know he had the demon. He was mute. He was blind. Now he sees. He speaks. The demon is gone. How can you argue with that? It's a miracle. We've all seen it with our eyes. We hear him speak. And we can't deny that. You can't deny that. So they say, well, yeah, that's true. But what he's doing is he's casting out demons by the prince of the demons. Now, you talk about grasping for straws, as we say in our vernacular. They are grasping at this point. So Jesus, he knew their thoughts. Of course, Jesus knows the thoughts of man. Needed not that any should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. John 2, the end of that chapter tells us. So Jesus knows their thoughts and said unto them, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself shall not stand. And if Satan cast out Satan, he is divided against himself. How shall then his kingdom stand? So there's our question. How shall then, as the King James puts it, his kingdom stand? How then will his kingdom stand? I believe is the way the New King James has it. So that's the first question here in this context. He goes on, though, and asks another question. And if I by Beelzebub, it's just another way of saying Satan, prince of the demons, if I by Beelzebub cast out demons, by whom do your children cast them out? Therefore they shall be your judges. But if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God is coming to you. And he's going to ask a related question, but let's look at these couple of questions first before we get to verse 29, that question there. So when Jesus says, how then will his kingdom stand, to whom does the his refer? Satan, right? Beelzebub, same thing. Yes. It's right, yeah, spirit being. It's I'd have to go back and look at a Bible dictionary to tell you for sure. I think it was a term that some of the original, or at least I don't know if I'd say original, but some of the inhabitants of the Promised Land, when Israel came into the Promised Land under Joshua and the conquest, that was a term that some of them would use for the devil, as I recall. Like I said, I'd have to verify that, but as I recall, I looked that up one time and did a little more research on it. But they're using it here for sure to refer to Satan. And so Jesus heals this man. The people's response, they're amazed. They say, this must be the Messiah, the Christ. There's no indication from the Pharisees that they rejoiced. Once again, no indication they're happy. This poor man who's been possessed by a demon, he was blind, he was mute. No indication that they're happy about that. They admit Jesus did a miracle, a genuine miracle that they can't deny, but then they attribute it to doing it through Satan, the power of Satan. Earlier, some had called Jesus Beelzebub, chapter 10, verse 25. Jesus' initial response to the Pharisees' claim is, it's nonsense, right? Because it would be a kingdom divided against itself. If the demons are under Satan's rule, Jesus cast them out, and if he does so by Satan's power, then Satan's working against himself. And that's his whole point here. That would be crazy. A kingdom, a city, a house divided against itself cannot stand. It's amazing how many times you hear people quote that, and they'll attribute it to Abraham Lincoln. He made that statement during the Civil War. A nation divided against itself cannot stand. Well, he was quoting from the Bible. And I don't think Lincoln made any kind of claim to originality with that, but somehow along the way, in fact, I saw it one time on a internet message board, social media or something, where somebody mentioned it, and I think somebody even said something about, like Jesus said, a nation divided against itself shall not stand, and somebody else came along and commented, replying to that, and said, actually, that was Abraham Lincoln that said that. No, Abraham Lincoln is quoting Jesus. But let us be clear. I think it goes without saying, but let's just make sure we understand. Jesus never, ever has or will worked in conjunction with the devil, Satan. Again, that goes without saying. What communion hath light with darkness? What fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? What concord hath Christ with Belial, which is another term that's sometimes used to describe Satan? That's from 2 Corinthians 6, 14 and 15. God has no fellowship with Satan. And that's pretty obvious here. But he asked this follow-up question: if I cast out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your sons cast them out? Now, the Pharisees' logic says he's casting out demons, so he must be in cahoots with the devil. Well, Jesus says you have your sons, disciples, in other words, who supposedly cast out demons. I don't believe he's saying here that they genuinely were casting out demons. I think he's making a point. Supposedly your sons can cast out demons. Well, okay, by whose power would they be doing that by then? Are they working with the devil? He's showing the just utterly illogical argument that they are using. The Pharisees said he did this by Satan's power. Jesus says it's by the Spirit of God. Their claim was blasphemous, accusing Jesus of himself having an unclean spirit. And it's in that context when you get to Mark's account in Mark 3, where Mark talks about because they said, Mark 3:30, because they said he had an unclean spirit, when he talks about blasphemy against the Holy Spirit and all the sins, it'll be forgiven, but if you blaspheme against the Holy Spirit, it will not be forgiven. And that's why I've said before, it's one of those difficult passages, and R.C. Foster in his ginormous book, Studies in the Life of Christ, he made me rethink it a little bit, but I'm still not convinced that what he's talking about there in Mark 3 and and really even here in this context, is this idea of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit is to see a miracle done, an indisputable miracle, and then to turn around and attribute that to the power of Satan. And I think Mark 3:30 lends strongly toward that interpretation, because Mark 3:30 says, because they said he hath an unclean spirit. And if that's the case, if I'm right about that, then that's not a sin that can even be committed today, because we're not going to witness a genuine, indisputable miracle today, because that time has passed. But again, R.C. Foster, he's one of those people that I've learned reading his book and stuff, other stuff that he's written. He's thought through stuff, and he's not easily dissuaded. And you start. I did a little bit of further research, and I thought, well, it may not be. Either way, it's not something that most Christians ask about the unpardonable sin, because they're afraid that somehow, without even knowing, they've committed it. It's not something you will ever commit unknowingly. I can assure you of that. And the Bible's pretty clear. If you're willing to turn away from a sin and turn to God genuinely with all your heart, He'll forgive you if you come to Him on His terms. Bob, you were going to say something a while ago.
As Christians, God gave us a brain, and we should use it, but we don't always take time to think deeply about things. For example, when someone says, you Christian people, you can't judge because, you're not God. And people get intimidated by that. But, when you think about it just for a second, aren't they making an accusation against one group? In other words, aren't they really judging the person when they do that? So they're guilty of the very thing. Now, in this passage right here, aren't the Pharisees trying to get Jesus? And they're getting Jesus by slandering Jesus. Boy, I wish someday I lived in a country where the people in politics say slandered each other, so I could really learn how that's done, okay? But anyway, they slandered Jesus. And who is he known as the slanderer?
The devil.
So they're accusing him, and they're using the devil's greatest tools to do that. Sometimes we just need to think how silly these people are when they try to fight against God. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God.
And it's one of those things that if it weren't so serious and sad at the same time, it would be absolutely hilarious to see. I mean, and it is still humorous in some way, not to make light of it, but it is kind of humorous to see how Jesus ties them up in knots every time they try to entrap him, because his logic is just unget-overable, as the old-timey preacher said. So, he points out here, their whole argument is utterly illogical, and he'll build upon that in the next few questions. He's going to go on, we'll talk about it next week, of course, but Matthew 12:29, how can one enter into a strong man's house and plunder his goods except he first bind the strong man? How can Jesus, he's going to overcome Satan, and the power of Satan in this world, the greatest power Satan has is that all humans die, because Satan helped tempt man and cause man to sin, not cause in the sense of forcing, but Jesus is going to overcome him, though. How can he do that except he first bind the strong man? And then he's going to talk about this brood of vipers these Pharisees are. And so, we'll talk about that, Lord willing, next week, because he's building on that. And every time they try to trap him, he shows over and over again he is truly the Son of God. And his arguments are insurmountable. We'll pick up, Lord willing, next week with Matthew 12:29 and cover the rest of the questions here in chapter 12 and move on from there. Thank y'all so much for your time and attention. I'm trying to think. Aaron will be here next week, but I believe he's just doing the worship. Is that right, Jimmy? Okay, so we'll be in here next week and pick up with Matthew 12:29. Thank y'all very much.